Welcome to our Bible study for this week. Now, this week we're going to start on Matthew chapter 19. We will only do the first section, and then, Lord willing, next week we'll proceed to the following three sections and complete the chapter. Now, as we usually do, I'm going to share with you how I see this chapter is divided, and then we'll begin to deal with the four different sections. So here we go. First of all, verses 1 through to 12, we have the question of divorce. Then we have verses 13, 14, and 15, where Jesus blesses the little children. Verses 16 to 22, the rich young ruler encounters Jesus. And finally, verses 23 to 30, the issue of possessions and the kingdom of heaven. Let us start off and read the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 19. When Jesus had finished these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and for every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, and marries another woman, commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "If this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry." Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way, others are made that way by men, others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. But one who can accept this should accept it." Now let me just say right from the beginning that this could well be one of the most difficult teachings of Jesus for us to understand, accept, and apply. Certainly during the history of the church, vast quantities of books have been written about the subject of divorce and remarriage. And many good men, many good Bible students have come to differing conclusions. And certainly those differing opinions persist. What may at first appear to be quite straightforward, when we dig down and consider the spectrum of the subject, we find that there are significant difficulties. Now add to this at the human level. Divorce is always painful. And I doubt, really, if there are any of those so-called amicable divorces. When this happens, people are hurting. And usually they're living with some form of guilt. And this alone determines that we should approach the subject with great care and sensitivity. For if we don't, we stand the chance of needlessly causing pain and hurt and alienation. So let's proceed, but let's go carefully and gently. Jesus had returned from Jesus had traveled rather to the east side of the River Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he continued his healing ministry. While he was there, he was approached by some Pharisees who had a question, and this was their question: is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? This brings us to one of the great debates of that time. There was great division amongst the Jewish scholars over one verse that we call Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. Let me just read that for you. This is what it says. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. Short verse, and just a very simple way that a man could divorce his wife. Just remember, in those days, a wife could not divorce her husband, so things have changed considerably. Now, to sum up the two sides of this great debate, there were two schools of thought. There was the school of Rabbi Hillel. He interpreted that Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, that's some uncleanness. He interpreted that in a very, very wide fashion indeed. If she put too much salt in a meal, if she burnt a meal, if she spoke to another man, that was just an excuse. Write a bill of divorce, in Hebrew it's called a get. Write out a get and get out. Then at the other end of the spectrum, there was a man called Rabbi Shammai. Rabbi Shammai was much, much more strict, and he had very much higher standards for divorce. And practically in the school of Rabbi Shammai, divorce was pretty much never permissible. And so that debate had raged for a very, very long time, and hence the question coming from the Pharisees. But remember, these are the Pharisees. It is a trick question. They're not really asking for Jesus' opinion as to which school of thought he's going to side with. No. They were hoping that Jesus would take sides with either Hillel or Shammai, and whichever he took sides with, he was going to alienate part of the population because opinions were divided. But remember this, that we knew that Jesus had already spoken about this subject. It's in Matthew 5, verse 32. Here is what it says. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Now, Jesus had already declared his mind on the whole subject, and the Pharisees certainly knew it. Add to that, if now Jesus took the same stand, remember he would fall foul of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas had divorced his wife, started an affair with his brother Philip's wife, and ultimately he had married the woman called Herodias. Now you remember the story. That was the reason that John the Baptist was imprisoned and ultimately executed, because he dared to criticize Herod Antipas for his marriage to Herodias. So, we think that Jesus may well have bypassed this question, but in any way, he goes right the way back to first principles, and he quotes to them Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. At the beginning, the Creator made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Now, out of that, we get at least 4 very, very important principles of Christian marriage. We find most of these are, of course, rejected by the world today, but as far as Christian marriage is concerned, here are the 4 principles. First, marriage is between male and female. Secondly, marriage involves leaving parents and forming a new family. The physical union, thirdly, creates a one flesh unity, which is described as being joined by God. And lastly, as Jesus points out, what is joined by God, man must not separate. Now, there are the 4 basic principles of Christian marriage. There is a lot more that could and should be said, but we would need to do that at another time on a special time when we talk about marriage. Right now, we're talking about the Pharisees' question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? Too much salt in the soup tonight, and therefore can you write a certificate of divorce? What we have in that section is we've got the ideal scriptural view of marriage as seen by Jesus. However, the Pharisees, they have an objection. They're trying to push Jesus a bit. They come back to him with this verse from Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. This whole idea of if there is some uncleanness, whatever that means, can he give a divorce? Now, the law of Moses did permit divorce, and Jesus points out it was because of the hardness of their hearts. The divorce was not so from the beginning, and the only valid reason is sexual immorality. Now, what we can grasp here in our altogether brief treatment of this particular chapter, of this passage, is the very high view that Jesus takes, and consequently the high view that the Christian church has taken of marriage. I would just like to read some words of John MacArthur. God engineered man and woman to complement, support, and give joy to each other through the mutual commitment of the marriage bond. It is by his divine hand that they are created to fulfill each other, encourage each other, strengthen each other, and produce children as fruit of their love for each other. Whether they recognize it or not, every couple who has enjoyed the companionship, happiness, and fulfillment of marriage has experienced the miraculous blessing of God. There is no good thing in marriage that is not derived from him. No child can be conceived by the creative act of man and woman who is not first conceived by the creative act of God. Every marriage and every child is a creation of God, and therefore divorce and abortion share this tragically evil common denominator. They kill a creation of God. Well, when Jesus provides this very high view of marriage, the disciples have an objection. It's here in verse 10. If this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it is better not to marry. So they were looking at this in very practical terms. If such was the case, and there was no divorce, and you happen to end up with the wrong partner, you are going to end up living in a very, very difficult situation for your whole life. In other words, the disciples said it's then best don't get married, but that, of course, is opposed to God's design for men and women. Jesus has something of a very enigmatic reply. And this is part of the complexity of the problem that we have, that many authors have tackled, and we are not going to solve in this very, very brief Bible study. And so, various Christian groups have taught, because of the words of Jesus, that singleness is the better way. Let's read these verses again. Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For some are eunuchs who have been born that way, others are made that way by men, others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept this. For those who are not familiar with it, a eunuch is a male that has had his male members removed, and he is no longer capable of sexual intercourse or reproducing. Now, that was a form of singleness, and basically what Jesus said, some people were in those days born that way for various reasons. Some were made that way, particularly slaves that would work in the harem, and some did it absolutely voluntarily, as did the early church father Eusebius. Thankfully, that whole issue of a physical castration has long gone and left the scene, and we hope it does not return. However, there are people that choose singleness, and it requires the gift of God to remain a single Christian person, because the plan of God is that most men and most women will become married. The problem, of course, for singleness is that we all know that the attraction between men and women is indeed very, very powerful, and enforced singleness without the gift of singleness will often lead to immorality. And so Paul wrote to the Corinthians, if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. It is better to marry than to burn with passion. So there are God's instructions for those people who are finding a problem with these issues and can find a partner. They should get married. And can I just say, the passage regarding eunuchs is a difficult one to interpret, and I've tried to put the most straightforward explanation on it. As Jesus says, not everyone can accept this and live with singleness, and marriage is therefore the better option. Now, this has been a very brief and sketchy overview of a difficult passage, and one that needs to be considered in conjunction with another passage, 1 Corinthians 7, which also deals with marriage, divorce, and remarriage. We do not have time to deal with that in a brief Bible study like this. I've tried to put in as straightforward and as simple way as possible the teachings of this passage. Now we come to the very difficult part of application. Before we leave this passage, we really need to understand that what we've been looking at is the right, the ideal situation. We, however, do not live in an ideal world. Over the last 5 decades, in fact, a little bit more, 6 or maybe 7 decades, the forces of the world against marriage have multiplied significantly. They are plentiful and they are powerful. Let me just mention a few. We've now got very easy divorce laws. Secondly, we've seen the breakdown of family structures because our society is now much more diversified and living in different areas, whereas in previous generations, for a young couple, you had parents and grandparents living close by, and very often they would assist and they would help and they would advise and they would keep young families together and prevent the breakdown of marriages. Well, largely that structure, that social structure, has gone. We also find in our society, particularly the West, there is moral permissiveness, feminism, humanism. They have attacked vigorously the Christian concept of marriage, mobility amongst society, entertainment like television, movies, magazines, and other influences have all worked against marriage. And even in some societies, divorce is kind of normalized. Think of a number of the film stars who want a fifth, sixth, seventh marriages. They kind of get tired of it. Oh, it's time for my divorce and the next marriage. And all of this has placed in people's minds the idea that marriage is not so special and we can just opt out when we want. Of course, Christians should do all they can to uphold the institution of marriage. However, a big question. What are we to do with Christians? What do we do about Christians who, despite this, have, for various reasons, they've got divorced from a first marriage, and they've found another partner, and they have got married again. Now, certainly some Christians, and may I just say, yes, they are Christians, they've been deeply influenced by the world, and they share the world's view and opinion of marriage. It is a very sad fact that divorce amongst Christians, as a statistic, is not very far behind the statistic for divorce in the world. So many Christians take the kind of easy view of marriage. However, we do find that some couples from previous marriages and now into a new one do come into our churches. I must say, they certainly need our care, our prayer, our fellowship, and our teaching. Of course, there are other Christians who have divorced out of horrific marriage situations. The one that I particularly think of are things like physical and mental abuse. And may I just add here, it is not just men who physically abuse women. We have figures to say that somewhere between 25 and 30% of serious physical abuse, abuse within marriage situations, is women against men. So domestic abuse is not just limited and a one-sided thing. What do we do about people that have left a situation like that and then have found another partner and have got married? Well, we find exactly the same thing with single people. They too find a very powerful need of companionship and intimacy, and they have found Christian partners and they have married. Some churches will treat them like pariahs. They'll pile on the guilt and not welcome them into their fellowship. And I think this is unnecessary. Number one, let us remember each one of us is faulty and fallible. That saying is true. Therefore, the grace of God go I. We need to also remember that the unforgivable sin is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, not divorce and remarriage. We're not going to throw our hands up and have a great divorce party and say, whoop-de-doo-dah, look, you guys got divorced. Oh, we congratulate you that you've got married. No, we're not going to do that. We're not approving of their situation. But we don't have to shout about it either. We want to try and make the best of what is a very, very difficult situation. there's no going back. Very often the previous partners, they've moved on, they've got married, so we can't tell them to go back. And the whole situation is very muddied and very difficult. And we will find that it involves a lot of thought and a lot of care to move forward. In this, although I have no dogmatic views, I think we should remember to be gentle, kind, and understanding. We can foster their present union with grace and compassion, and there are some things that we will just have to leave to the Lord for Him to deal with. It's not a very satisfying answer. It is not one that is clear and with no difficulties. With all my reading, I have not found an easy way out of these difficult circumstances, other than to say we need to deal with it carefully, kindly, and with compassion. Well, that's pretty much our time up for this week, and our very, very brief dealing of the question of divorce as it is in Matthew chapter 19. There is just so much more, and we could spend weeks trying to deal with all the influences, inferences, and shades of meaning and the nuances in that passage, but we don't have that time, and so we shall have to move on. And Lord willing, next week we shall move on to consider the rest of the chapter of Matthew chapter 19. Until then, may the Lord richly bless each one of you in Jesus' name. Amen.